More people are actively involved in the exciting world of sales than in any other profession. More than ever before, there's merchandise to be sold and money to be made. Regardless of your product or service or how long you've been selling it, the principles of successful selling remain the same. You're about to learn all about these proven sales principles from America's master motivator, Zig Ziglar. In this live seminar recording, Zig explains how, with a positive self-image and a carefully planned presentation, you can sell anybody anything. Step 1. Build a healthy self-image.
Now, everybody I've ever talked with agrees that your self-image is important. But what we're going to do now, we're going to look at some very specific steps which you can take to make absolutely certain that your image is good and getting better. That's important because you cannot consistently perform in a manner which is inconsistent with the way you see yourself. So how do you build a good, healthy self-image? Number one is you take inventory. You take a physical inventory. For example, many insurance companies will insure certain parts of your body. They guarantee if you lose an eye, they'll give you X number of dollars. If you break a leg or lose a leg, they'll give you X number of dollars. But let me ask you a question. How much would you take for an arm, for a leg, for an ear, for an eye, for any part of your body? When you begin to analyze it, I have seen where juries and insurance companies have literally paid millions of dollars for eyes and for legs and for broken backs and all of those things. So when you analyze it physically, you are worth millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. You are important. Mentally, let's take a little inventory about you. You see, if they were to try to duplicate your brain with a computer, experts have estimated that it would take a building the size of an Empire State Building to house it. That it would literally cost in excess of $100 million, maybe $1 billion or $10 billion. And even with all of that expenditure, it still could not do what you instantly do on an everyday basis, and that is originate a thought. And what I want to say is when you analyze the you, when you analyze an inventory physically, mentally, and spiritually, you are somebody. And that ought to make you feel good. Step number 2 to build that image is you need to make up and dress up and go up. When you dress up, you feel better in test after test after test. They have proved beyond any doubt that students perform better in school. They're more orderly. They're more mannerly. They have proved that salespeople in stores and on call sell better when they are dressed up properly and the ladies are made up and the guys have their appropriate dress on for themselves. They feel better. How many of you have experienced that? So step number 2, if you want to improve your image, you make up and you dress up and you go up. And then, of course, you need to listen to speakers. And the truth is, that's exactly what you're doing. Listen to teachers. Listen to preachers. Listen to people who have something to say, who will give you a lift and make you feel better about yourself. Then the next step you can take is remember, you oftentimes need to walk before you can run. A high jumper who can jump 6 feet is not going to go out on the first day or the first jump he takes and say, set it at 6 feet, that's as high as I can go. He'll put it a little lower, and his confidence builds as he goes up. When we teach our children to become cooks and really do things around the house, we don't move them from oatmeal cookies to baked Alaska, do we? We move them one short step at a time. You don't go from 2 times 2 to 28,961 times 49,368. But you take some steps along the way there, and every step gives you that extra amount of confidence. As a sales manager, occasionally some of our people used to get in a little slump from time to time. We've all seen it happen. And what we would do is encourage them to take the lowest priced product we had, a small item with a low ticket value, and simply go make a few sales there. That got the momentum going, and then we would move them up to the next one, and the first thing you know, they are really doing well. The next step is you need to join the Smile and Compliment Club. Now, I want to emphasize a point. I believe with all my heart, my philosophy has been for a long time, that you can have everything in life you want if you will just help enough other people get what they want. And when I talk about the Smile and Compliment Club, I mean simply that if you will look at people and smile, and if you will compliment them on some specific observable behavior, now that is a key there, then they're going to feel better. And you know, the interesting thing is when they feel better, they'll grin all over, and in most cases they will just thank you profusely. They'll feel better, but you know what? You're going to feel even better than they will. Now, remember a moment ago I said you can have everything in life you want if you'll just have enough other people get what they want? You need to take that and apply it not as a tactic, but as a philosophy in life. For example, if you will start doing some things for somebody who can do absolutely nothing in return for you. I'm talking about visiting a shut-in. I'm talking about reading a book into the microphone for the blind. I'm talking about taking some food or clothing to someone whom you know is in need, and not just at Christmas and not just at Thanksgiving, but when you do something for somebody else, there's nothing on this earth that makes you feel as good as that does. It really builds that image. Now, you need to be careful of whom you associate with if you want your image to really grow. You know, the right people really can give you a lift and make you feel good about yourself. And the wrong people can literally pull you down and make you feel less about yourself. You're influenced by the people you're around. There's no question about that. To build your image, you need to list your positive qualities. Now, I want you to think with me on this one just for a moment. The truth is you have an incredible number of them, and they can be developed and extended even further. You see, you can be just as honest as anybody. You can have just as much character as anybody. You can develop just as much positive mental attitude as anybody, just as much enthusiasm. You can be just as dependable, just as sincere, just as helpful. You can be just as studious, work just as hard, be just as reliable, be just as punctual. And when you start listing all of those qualities, let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. Those are the qualities that will get you a job anywhere, at any time, under any circumstances. You put them all together and you begin to feel good about yourself. To build a good, healthy self-image, you need to list your past successes. You see, there isn't a one of you, if you really think about it, who hasn't done many, many things about which you ought to feel good about your successes. Maybe you've lost 20 pounds. Maybe you've made friends with an old grouch that nobody could get along with. Maybe you passed a course which was particularly tough. Maybe you made a sale in an area or became number one in an area which was already sold out. How many of you have seen that happen in the world of sales so many times? When you start analyzing all of the things, what you're doing is you are emphasizing the positive. And when you begin to emphasize the positive, that image begins to grow. Self-acceptance is what I'm talking about. Yes, the top professionals in the world of selling really have worked on their self-image. That's so important because you see 73% of all sales interviews end with no attempt to close because the salesperson has that fear of rejection. They don't understand that it really is not a rejection personally. It's simply a business refusal. Now, when your image is solid and you believe in what you're selling, you move confidently towards closing the sale. So I really encourage you to get busy in this area of building a good, healthy self-image. There's one very important thing I'd like you to remember about building a positive self-image. Nobody on the face of this earth can make you feel inferior without your permission. When you refuse to give others that permission, you will start accepting yourself. And once you accept yourself, you will have removed a significant barrier to the growth and success you're capable of attaining. Now, do me and you just one little favor. Stop the tape, then sit back and close your eyes. Just relax for about 5 minutes and picture yourself already possessing that healthy self-image and all the other things necessary for your success. Remember, it must happen in your mind before it will happen in your life. Pretty exciting, isn't it?
Step 2. Develop prospecting skills.
In the world of selling, the top professionals make prospecting their #1 priority. Now, why is that? Well, it's very simple. Every facet of selling depends upon the prospecting, our economic stability of the sales individual and their company. Prospecting is acquiring the name of an individual who is financially and authoritatively qualified to make a decision on my product and service. You see, if they're not qualified to make a decision, then you really don't have a prospect, do you? What you have is a suspect. Now, this is true in the world of selling, whether I'm in computers or whether I'm selling real estate or automobiles or whether I'm selling boats. Prospecting, ladies and gentlemen, though, is kind of like mining gold. When you go in a gold mine, you're going to move around a lot of dirt before you find the nugget. And a lot of times in prospects, you've got to do a lot of prospecting. You've got to talk to a lot of people in order to find a prospect instead of that suspect. Now, when and where do we prospect? Well, I'm absolutely convinced that we've got to always be thinking prospecting. We need to get up in the morning, and if our mate says, "What'll you have for breakfast?" I think I'll take a prospect. At lunch, if somebody says, "Well, what you going to have for lunch?" I think I'll take 2 prospects. At dinner, "What you going to have for dinner?" I think I'll have 3 prospects. We really need to be thinking prospects wherever you are, because prospects literally are everywhere. Well, let me share with you what I think is a fascinating little story. Maybe I think it's fascinating because it happened to me. But years ago, I was living in Florence, South Carolina. Now, I was working up in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I was selling hope chest items for single girls and putting on demonstrations for married couples. Well, it was Saturday evening, and I was heading back home to Florence, South Carolina, and I was flat hightailing it on down the highway. It was ridiculous how fast I was going. And then I looked up in the rearview mirror and I saw that I wasn't the only one on the highway. There was a friendly little light back there. And so I obviously stopped, and the gentleman and I had a real nice talk. As a matter of fact, I think I would have persuaded him, since we had a mutual friend, to let me go, except he had radioed ahead and told somebody else to block the highway. He said, "This dude is going to leave me if I'm not careful." So he gave me a ticket, but he did say, "I'll let you stop by in Whiteville, North Carolina on Monday on your way back up and pay your ticket." Well, when I walked in, the ticket was $30 or $40, an enormous sum of money back in 1952. And I'll tell you, when I started counting out those dollars, it just really broke my heart. And then I noticed that the young lady whom I was talking with had on an engagement ring. And so I said to her, "I can't help but notice that you're wearing a diamond." She said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions?" She said, "No, go right ahead." I said, "Are you at this point saving any money on this job?" She said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I am." I said, "Well, let me ask you, if I had something that was really nice, would you be in position, if it was something you would use the rest of your life, could you increase your savings, 25 cents a day?" She said, "Well, I certainly could." I said, "Well, let me ask you this. If I had something out in the car that was really beautiful, that would fit the bill for exactly what you'll be using for the rest of your life, would you be courteous enough to spend 5 minutes looking at it?" She said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I'm just fixing to go on break, so as a matter of fact, I would." So I said, excuse me. And you know, a lot of folks say, excuse me, but that's wrong. I ran back out to the car, and I picked up my sample case, and I scooted back in. I made the presentation, and one of her friends, who had been married about 10 years, was there, and listening in on the presentation also. I asked the obligating question, and the young lady turned to the married lady and said, well, what would you do? Before she could answer, I said, excuse me, ma'am, let me ask you a question. I said, if you knew what you now know when you was this young lady's age, knowing all the expenses of a home and a family and insurance and house payments and all those other things, and you had the same chance that she now has, if you had known that when you were her age, would you have gotten a set of this merchandise? She said, I certainly would. So I turned to the engaged girl and I said, that's exactly what you're going to do, isn't it? She said, yes, I am. And when I got through, I turned to the married lady and I said, now, ma'am, 10 years ago when you got married, you did not have this opportunity. But just because you did not have it then does not mean that you should not take advantage of it now, does it? She said, no, it doesn't. I said, then I suppose you want the same order, don't you? She said, as a matter of fact, I do. I wrote both of those sales. As I was pulling out on my way back up to Wilmington, North Carolina, I saw the highway patrolman. And for the first time in my life, I stopped a highway patrolman. Literal truth. And I thanked him for giving me the ticket. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that prospecting is something you ought to do everywhere. Now, you really don't have to go 90 miles an hour to get them, and you certainly don't have to pay a $30 or $40 fine in order to get one, but we really need to prospect. We need to use what I also call, thanks to a good friend of mine who taught me this little lesson, he uses what he calls eagle eye prospecting. He was selling up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and he was selling training programs. And as he would ride on his way to see his prospects, every time he would pass a business that looked like it was the kind of business that could use his kind of training, he'd pick up his cassette microphone and he would dictate the name of that business and where the location was, and if there was a phone number, he would get that. Then by the time he got home, he would have anywhere from 5 to on occasion as many as 25 different prospects. He gave those names to his daughter, who then got on the telephone and did a general inquiry as to the nature of the business, the number of people working there, and this kind of thing. Then he did the follow-up calls after many of them had been eliminated, because really a lot of them were suspects instead of prospects, but he used it very effectively. Now, here are a couple of other quick ways to acquire prospects. From advertisements in the Yellow Pages, for example, newspapers and magazines, from lists available at the Better Business Bureau, and an amazing number of people do not even know that those things are available. The Chamber of Commerce, you can get them through direct mail advertising or at your local library. Now, this is another one that people often overlook, but you can pick up a copy of Contacts Influential, which lists the names of organizations by street address and includes their CEOs. This information, ladies and gentlemen, I can absolutely guarantee is truly important. Now, when you're doing cold calling or eagle eye prospecting, when it takes you and gives you the chance to get the name, then refer them through this source to check out on them, you really do have something going for you. Because every business on the street, as well as the businesses that you have called by number, will be listed in these books. And so you can have some additional information. Then there's another, which really is an expansion of something we've already talked about. It's what I call the COD method of prospecting. By C, I mean communication. We need to communicate with everybody exactly the business we're in and what we're doing. As a friend of mine, Calvert Roberts, says, you got to circulate in order to percolate. And then the O stands for observation. You simply need to observe the needs which are there. You need to observe whatever your product is. We become tuned in. If we really are in the business we're in, we become tuned in to the people who have the needs. I'm certain you've all noticed this. when you buy a particular car which you have never bought before, all of a sudden everybody on the streets driving the same kind of car you're now driving. They're in the parking lot, they're in the garages, they're on the streets, they're on the highways. Now what am I saying? I'm saying become aware and observe, and you'll see a lot of prospects. The D stands for dedication. You know, folks, dedication and commitment is so important in what we're doing. Now, who's the ideal prospect for you? Well, I believe you are your ideal prospect. Now, what do I mean by that? I think you ought to be buying from yourself. With the exception of 747s, and I don't necessarily think if you sell them that you got to buy one, but if you're selling Ford automobiles, you ought to be driving a Ford. If you're selling Chevrolets, you ought to be driving a Chevrolet. In other words, your commitment, your belief in what you're selling ought to be so strong that you absolutely are using it. When we're selling, regardless of who it is we're selling to, we need to keep the interest of the other person in mind, because people do not buy to help us. They do not buy because of our interest. They buy because they see it as a solution to their problem. They buy because they're sold on it. Always think in terms of the prospect's interest. Where do you get your prospects? One of my good friends who used to live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, told me of a rather unique club. I encourage you, if there's not one in your locality, to start this particular club. It was literally a lead exchange club. That was the name of it. And you restrict them to a small number of professional salespeople, 15 to 20. One morning a week they get together for breakfast. And the admission for the breakfast is each person brings in 5 prospects whom we consider to be good prospects. Well, now, if you've got 15 people there and then 14 of the others bring you 5 prospects, we're talking about 70 people. Now, obviously, some of them will just be suspects for the product you sell. But you can quickly narrow them down, and out of 70, if you eliminate, through your associates and mailing and so forth, if you eliminate 90% of them, you've still got 7 brand new prospects to buy what you're selling. Now, this example simply illustrates that you look for new leads wherever you are, but you don't forget the old customers, because this is the way you grow in the business. You grow the account. When we get a new product, or you get a new product, or an option to go with what you already have, you can turn that old customer into a new one. And then, of course, there's the familiar referral prospecting. And so many people do not really know how to ask for prospects. I have been on sales calls training a new salesperson, or training a salesperson, or working with an established one, and when they finish their presentation, whether they did or did not sell, they would say, now I'd like you to give me the names of 5 of your friends. And they would put 5 cards in front of them. Well, let me tell you something. In most cases, that will absolutely frighten them. They cannot instantly think of 5 people, and so a lot of times they stall. They're kind of stunned and say, well, I don't know of anybody. Then you simply don't want to use that method, because that's not effective. What you do is this. You take out 1 card and just hold it in your hand. And you say, Mr. Prospect, let me ask you a question. If your best friend were to come by here right now and walk into this office, would you introduce him to me? What do you think he's going to say? Well, of course I would. Obviously I would. Let me ask you to do this then. He probably is not going to come by. I would like to get you to introduce me to him in another way. If you will, just give me his name and address, and I'd like to share with him what I have shared with you. And it'll be so helpful if you will just take your business card and on the back of it write, Charlie, this guy is worth talking to, or this lady really has something you'd be interested in. Get the lead in that way. Now, in most cases, you've got to be specific when you start prospecting. Do you have somebody who's in Rotary with you that would be interested or be a prospect for what we're doing? Or better still, do you have somebody that you play golf or bridge with who has the same needs? You see, a lot of times they try to do too much screening for you if you emphasize the interest, but when you talk about the needs, that is a different thing. Remind them of people they go to church with, somebody they're on the school board with, somebody who lives in the neighborhood. Jog their memories is what I'm saying there. Now, when you get the reference there, if you can possibly do so for some of them, if you can get the prospect to give that prospect they've just given you a phone call, they call the prospect and say, you know, I'm excited about something, and I'm not going to try to tell you what it's all about, but I just talked with a fella or a lady that you're going to be interested in talking with. Have them open the door. Now, if they're reluctant to doing something like this, then you say to them, well, let me ask you a question. You know, sometimes they don't want to put their friends on a list, you know, so to speak. Then you get right down to the nitty-gritty. You ask them a question. Well, let me ask you, are you upset because your friend sent me to see you? Or do you actually appreciate the fact that they sent me because now we've solved a real problem which you had? Now, a lot of times what you can do is you can use the prospecting as a trial close. In other words, as you get down to the close of the sale, you can say, incidentally, one of the things we use is the radiation method, because if this concept is spread, whatever it is you're selling, if this product is spread, then everybody will be better off. So if you don't mind, let me get you number one to jot down the name of your closest friend. And while you're doing that, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions to complete the form. And then you can use it in conjunction with the close. Now, when you start prospecting, remember that a suspect is just a name on a card. But a prospect, when you start identifying them, is someone who has a need for what you're selling. They have a desire for what you're selling. They have the money to buy what you're selling. And they have the authority to go ahead and make the decision. Now, that's important, because McGraw-Hill very recently did a substantial study. And here's what they discovered. It cost $178 to make a sales call in America today, an average of many companies. Now, that includes salary, airfare, hotel bills, expenses, insurance, the whole thing. And it takes 5 2/10 sales calls to make the sale. Now, what I'm talking about is you've got $900 tied up in that sale, but $178 in the call. You cannot financially afford to be calling on suspects. They've got to be qualified prospects. To emphasize this particular point, I have a good friend who also sells training. And this particular friend of mine sells it by putting on a free training session. The only qualification he imposes upon the management there is that the person who makes the decision must be present. Now, over the years, when the decision maker is present, his closing percentage, and it's a high-ticket item, is 45%. If the decision maker is called out of town or skips out on the meeting, then his closing percentage is 8%. Despite the fact that they always assure him, oh, the boss will take my recommendation, or the decision maker relies on us, you know, you go ahead and put the training session on. But let me tell you one of the most basic things in selling, ladies and gentlemen, and if you'll hear this, it'll make a difference in your sales career. There's a vast difference in understanding something well enough to buy it, as versus understanding it well enough to sell it. So that person who attended the training session might have been enthused, but it's a 2-hour training session. And actually, when he goes in to tell the decision maker all of the facets, the major thing he will remember is the price. And despite the fact that the people were enthused about it, the closing ratio is only 8% if the decision maker is not there. I think you now understand how important it is to distinguish between suspects and qualified prospects. It is widely held that a qualified prospect is 5 times more likely to close than an unqualified suspect. It is therefore obvious that you stand a far better chance of making a sale with a qualified prospect instead of wasting your time and money chasing after unqualified suspects.
Step 3. Develop a planned presentation.
Most people don't plan to fail, they really don't. And yet there are a lot of failures because people fail to plan. In the world of selling, you see, you've got to have a game plan and you've got to have the expectations of really doing something. Prospects are too valuable. They cost too much money for us to burn by not having a planned sales presentation. To waste a prospect on an unplanned sales call is downright criminal. It takes preparation. You can compensate actually for the lack of talent with plans. When we learn how to respond effectively to the prospect's questions or objections, then we will be more effective in making that sale. No plan, and you waste your time and the prospect's time in the prospect. Your customer feels very uncomfortable when you're sitting there muddling through a presentation. The unplanned presentation actually suggests that the product and the company isn't very good. On the other hand, a planned, an organized, a precise presentation gives the impression that the prospect is dealing with a professional who probably has an excellent product to go along with it. Now, the plan's content is important. What the product is and does is what we really want to emphasize. What are the benefits? How does it meet the customer's needs? Let me give you some examples. Maybe the best known one, last year in excess of 500,000 quarter-inch drills were sold. And yet nobody wanted a quarter-inch drill, did they? What they wanted was a quarter-inch hole. Nobody wants 4 wheels and a body and upholstery and so forth. What they do want is dependable transportation. Now, let me emphasize this. Within the frame of the presentation, the delivery itself must be very carefully planned, because there's a lot of ways to say a lot of different things, but there's only one best way to say anything. Now, I know a lot of people say, now, wait a minute, Ziglar, you're not going to talk about a canned sales talk, are you, man? I can spot those dudes a mile off, you know. Get it out of a can, Ziglar, I can tell it. Well, let me tell you something, friend. If you can spot a canned sales talk, it is because it has been improperly canned. They're canned sales talks. That's what they are. A good planned presentation will keep you right on track. And what it does is free your creative brain so that at any time you can respond to the unexpected and then go right back to the presentation. That enables you to keep on the time frame within the time limit. Because if you've told the prospect you'll be there 20 minutes and you labor for 45 minutes, your chances of making the sale are absolutely going to be diminished. The presentation is memorized, but you adapt it to your personality. When you've got that talk down, then your best qualities will shine through. And let me simply say that this also gives you flexibility, which is crucial when it comes to dealing with objections which the customer brings up. You see, as we look at objections in this context, we need to understand that objections are literally our best friends. If the prospect does not object, you can rest assured they have no interest in what you're saying. You can also say this: if there were no objections, there would be no need for you or me, the salespeople. The prospect would simply go ahead and buy. But what we need to do is understand what is the difference between a question and an objection. A question is simply something that is seeking information. How long will it take to get here? What different colors do you have? What terms can you offer? What's the service policy of the company? Those are questions. Now, an objection is a call for information also, but it shows concern and interest in what you're selling. When you're questioning or when you're being questioned or they raise an objection, you need to remember that you don't have to answer all of the objections to make the sale. Now, that's something it took me a long time as a young salesman to learn. You don't have to answer them all. For example, the suit of clothes I have on, I obviously bought it. I can assure you it was not given to me. Now, there were a couple of things I did not like about this suit. I was not enthusiastic about the price. I'll just have to lay it right out there in front. I wasn't really motivated about that. I didn't like the fact that I have to wear a belt with it, because believe it or not, after traveling nearly 4 million miles on the road, occasionally I still do forget my belt. And that was one of the things I did not like about this particular suit. But the redhead looked at it and she said, "Honey, you know, that's one of your colors." And then she rubbed it and she says, "And it feels so good. And it fits you well." Well, I'm wearing the suit. You don't have to overcome all of the objections, but what you need to understand is that when the value of the product exceeds the value of the money that the product requires, at that point, you can get in business if you ask for the sale. Now, let me emphasize a point. Most objections are the same. If you were to record all the objections you've received in your sales career, I can assure you at least 80% of them would fit under the category of about 7 or 8 pretty standard objections. In many cases, you can eliminate the objections or dramatically reduce them by changing the structure of your presentation. You need to be looking at that one pretty carefully, because if the same one keeps coming up, that can be handled in a presentation in many cases. Now, you need to remember that there are many kinds of prospects that you're going to be dealing with. The animal prospect, for example, who's going to bear it in mind. And then there's the insomniac prospect who's going to sleep on it. There's the musical prospect who'll make a note of it. And then there's the playful prospect who's just feeling out the market. I mean, we got a lot of different kinds. But remember this, all prospects have 2 basic things in common. Doesn't make any difference where you categorize them, they have 2 things in common. Number 1, they want to be right. And number 2, they want to be understood. Now, there are 4 opportunities for handling objections. The first time is before they occur. The second time is when they occur. The third time is later on in the presentation. And the fourth time is never. Now, the ideal time, as I said earlier, is before they occur. That's when the presentation is made. And then the second time is when it's appropriate. A lot of times a person will bring up an objection and you're talking about something entirely different and it's not appropriate to handle at that moment. So what you say is, "I'm delighted you asked that question. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. If I forget it, please remind me, because this is important and you'll be excited with what I have to say about it." Then you go ahead with the presentation. Now, for example, if the prospect asks a question, and let's say you're demonstrating tires, and the strength of the tires, and the prospect might say to you, "I don't believe these tires are rugged enough for our use." Now, what do? Well, first of all, you hear the objection out. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, said, "He who answers a matter before he hears it is not wise." Let the prospect voice their objection. Let them get it out. Now, number 2, you need to act pleased that they brought it up. And you should be pleased, because that says, "Hey, I'm interested." Remember that objections thrive on opposition, but they die with agreement. What do you say? "I'm really glad that you raised that issue." Don't use the word objection. And you truly should be, because that says he now is a viable prospect. The number 3, the third step you take, you change the objection to a question. In other words, Mr. Prospect, your question, as I understand it, is, will these tires hold up under the day-to-day pounding which our city streets will give them? Is that what you're asking? You see, that way you get the customer involved, and that's so important. The number 4, what do? You use the question, objection if you will, as the reason for going ahead. And you simply say something like this: "Actually, Mr. Prospect, the question you raised is the reason we do so much business in this city. Because fleet test after fleet test firmly established the fact that our super reinforced steel-belted radials with Durabrig are ideally suited for rugged city street usage. As a matter of fact, that's the very reason that XYZ Company uses our tires." And then you take step number 5. You parade all of the testimonials out in front of that person, and you close the sale with the testimonials. Now, if the prospect brings up another objection after you have completed your presentation, you handle it in the same way. But if they bring up yet another objection, you respond with a question. Mr. Prospect, do you mind if I ask you a question? And then you get their answer. Most of the time they're going to obviously say, well, go ahead. Then the question is this: is this the only additional objection that stands between you and a favorable decision concerning our product, or would there be something else? Now, if that's the only other question, you answer it. You assume the sale and you attempt to close. But if the prospect says, well, I'm also concerned about, and then they start bringing in a number of other things, like that. For example, when they do that, you bring out what I call a talking pad, and you begin to write them down. It's just a little yellow pad, and if they say, for example, it might be price, and so you write down price. It might be concern about the credibility of the company. It might be the guarantee, but you write these things down. And then you simply say, are these the only questions, or would there be something else which stands between you and ownership of the product? You need to find out what the problem is. Are there other questions that they have in mind? And then you take your yellow pad, you deal with those objections one at a time. And as you finish each one, you ask, is that a satisfactory answer to your question? And if they say yes, then you cross it out. Or does that clarify the issue to your satisfaction? Would be another way of putting it. Now, when you've crossed all of them out, subliminally, and think about this, subliminally, you've eliminated in the prospect's mind any reason for not owning the product, which means the chances are excellent he'll go ahead and sign the agreement. Now, the fourth time to answer an objection is never. Some objections are silly. But also, please understand this, regardless of how weird, regardless of how wild, regardless of how far out it might be, if they bring the same objection up, you must deal with it. Now, please understand that we are not in the objection answering business. I've actually been on sales calls with a lot of salespeople, and they'd answer an objection, you know, and then in essence they'd fold their hands and say, okay, I'll handle that one pretty good. Just go ahead, try me with another one. Go ahead, I dare you to. Give me another one. I've seen it happen. Young salespeople would do that. They'd answer it and then challenge them to bring up another one. When you answer objection, then you close. I think you can now see how a well-developed, thought-out presentation is truly an asset to the sales professional. Many salespeople feel that memorizing their presentation will inhibit their selling. In fact, just the opposite occurs. Memorizing and really internalizing your presentation gives you the freedom to be flexible without losing track of your goal, closing the sale.
Step 4, develop techniques for closing the sale.
When you get the prospect, you're on first base. When you get the appointment, you're on second. When you make the presentation, you're on third. And so far, all you've done is invest time and money, your time and money, and the prospect's time. Until you close the sale, you're going to stay on third base. So closing the sale is important. The question is, where will these procedures work that we're talking about? I want to get you to do something for me right now. I would like to get each one of you to hold up 3 fingers on your writing hand. Just stick them up in there. 3 fingers, please. Now, if you will look around, you will notice that 96% of them are these 3. Notice it. If you look a little more carefully, you'll notice that 3% of them are these 3 fingers. And if you'll look even more closely, you'll notice an oddball every once in a while can manage to put these 3 up. Now, let me get you to do something else. I want you to think of a color. Just think of a color. Now, those of you who thought of red, would you hold up your hands, please? At any given time, 60% of the audience will hold up their hands and say they chose red. Think of a flower. Now, there are hundreds of different flowers, but those of you who thought of a rose, would you hold up your hands, please? Now, 50%, as a general rule, will do that. Now, that's true in Auckland, New Zealand, Chicago, Illinois, and Portland, Maine, or any other place. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that we have an awful lot of similarities. And in the world of selling, we need to concentrate on these folks, not these folks. We need to deal with the similarities. We need to deal with the largest group of people if we're going to sell. Now, if we're going to persuade other people to act in their own best interest by buying the product you are trying to sell, you need to think of what is similar about them and the other people you've dealt with. Now, that's not to say that we're not all different also, because we are. But in selling, there are some standard procedures that will work, because the procedures are being applied to people who have the same basic needs and the same basic desires. So let me share with you some of the techniques for closing the sale. I'd like to share with you some of my favorites. Now, closing is the natural or normal end for the presentation. The first one I'd like to share with you has to do with a story, as they generally do. 4 years ago, we built a home 120 miles east of Dallas. That's where I go down and do my writing. It's in a beautiful area. We hit the jackpot with a lot. We got a marvelous builder. His wife is an internationally famous interior designer, and we kind of got her as part of the package. We certainly could not afford her. She does interior decorating for hotels, the monsters, the big ones, the beauties. But I'll never forget, we'd been in the home about a month. We were down there, and Bill Tennyson, the builder, and his wife, Joyce Wynn, came in, and old Bill was carrying a package. I said, "What's you got there, Bill?" He said, "Well, I got a little something for you." Joyce spoke up and said, "Yeah, Zig, you know, your wall is over 30 feet high. That's the ceiling in the great room is 30 feet high." And she said, "That wall's a little blank." And she said, "We need to put this wall rug on it." Well, I did what most prospects do. I asked the price. It was not inexpensive. And so I said, "Joyce, I don't know about that." I said, "That's a lot of money." She said, "Well," said, "old Bill's already with me," and said, "He's got his ladder out there with him. Why don't we go ahead and just hang it up on the wall? You might not even like it. And if it looks good, then you can decide. If it doesn't, no harm done." Well, this old hard-headed fellow agreed that that was a logical approach to take. So I said, "Okay, hang her up and we'll see." 3 hours later, when I was out jogging, it occurred to me what she had done to me. She had used one of the most natural closes of them all. It's called the puppy dog close. If you can get the product in the hand of the prospect so they can see what it is, you got a good chance of them buying. Selling sometimes is simplicity itself. For example, the 3-question close would certainly fit in that category. A lot of times after you finish the demonstration, if you'll just ask the 3 questions, can you see where this would save you some money? Are you interested in saving money? If you were ever going to start saving money, when do you think would be the best time to start? If you're selling convenience, can you see where this would save you a lot of time and effort? Are you interested in saving time and effort? If you were ever going to start saving time and effort, when do you think would be the best time to start? A lot of times a question should make that prospect think, and if they think right, then they're going to act. For example, how many of you ever have a prospect complain about your price? They even hint that it's a little too high. Can I see your hand? So the prospect says, "It's too high." You don't get in an argument with them. What you do is you lower your voice and you look them in the eye and simply say, "Well, you know, Mr. Prospect, many years ago, our company made a basic decision. We decided that it would be easier to explain price one time than it would be to apologize for quality forever. And I'll bet you're glad we made that decision, aren't you?" The next little close that I'd like to share with you is something we call the cost price close. You need to understand that the prospect needs to see and hear if it is humanly possible, because we are moved emotionally by what we hear and logically by what they see. The prospect says, well, the price is too high. And then you can simply say to them, well, let me ask you, Mr. Prospect, is it price or is it cost which you're concerned about? And many times the prospect will say, well, what's the difference? Then I share this little example. Well, Mr. Prospect, when my son was 6 years old, we went down to buy him a bicycle. We went to the Swin bicycle shop. The price was $64.95. Well, you're not going to buy a 6-year-old a $65 bicycle. This was 16 years ago. And at that time, 65 bucks, that is a lot of money. So we went down to the discount store. Found a neat little bicycle for just $34.95. Price, much, much better. 2 months later, we went down to get the new handlebars. Now, fortunately, it was still in warranty. It didn't cost us anything. But about a month later, we had to go back for some more new handlebars and no more warranty, so it was $4.50. About 2 months later, we went back in. The entire sprocket apparatus had completely come undone. I mean, it was destroyed. The bill was $15 and change. About a month later, the bearings in the front wheel came unzipped, and we took it back down, and it's going to be $3, $4, $5. I don't know what it was. I threw in the towel. I said, no more. Now, the price of that bicycle was $34.95. My son rode the bicycle 6 months. When you added the other factors, the sprocket repairs and the handlebars, the total was $54.45. So the cost for the bicycle is $9 a month for him to ride that bicycle for the 6 months, not counting downtime. We then went down to the Swin bicycle shop, bought the $64.95 bicycle. For the next 5 years, my son rode that bicycle every day, and for 5 more years, even though he was far too big for it, you know how kids do, they'll get a little bicycle out and play with it. He made a dirt bicycle out of it. He rode that bicycle 10 years. The price was $64.95. The cost, 10 years, $64.95, that's $6.50 a year. Let me ask you again, Mr. Prospect, is it price you're concerned about, or is it cost? You see, there are a lot of people who can beat us on price, but nobody beats us on cost. And because price is a one-time thing and cost is the lifetime investment, lifetime of the product, you're interested in the lowest possible cost, aren't you? Another close. Make sure the prospect understands what he's deciding when you make the sale. I call this one the diagram close. Several years ago, we were in the market for a new copier. The one we chose was $10,000, give a few dollars or take a few dollars. The little machine we had was long ago outdated. It was slow, it turned out poor work, took us an awful lot of extra time, turned out a lot of fouled up copies. We should have bought a new one 2 or 3 years earlier. We figured that we would save at least 2 hours a day in labor cost with a new machine. We do an awful lot of that kind of copying. Well, even at $5 an hour, $5 an hour, 2 hours a day, that's $10 a day. That's $50 a week. That's $2,500 a year. Now, in the diagram close, you work it like this. If the person invests the $10,000, then their bank account goes to zero, assuming that they put everything in the copier, which obviously they wouldn't do that. But if you invest the $10,000, then your bank account goes to zero, but you've got the machine. Now, 1 year later, saving the $2,500, you see, you've got $2,500 and the machine. 2 years later, you've got $5,000 and the machine. 3 years later, you've got $7,500. Does everybody see where I'm getting these figures? No problem understanding it, okay? $7,500 and the machine. 4 years later, you got $10,000 back and you got your machine. Now, if the prospect does not invest, then he's got that full $10,000 but no machine. A year later, he's only got $7,500 and no machine. 2 years later, he's only got $5,000 and no machine. 3 years later, he's only got $2,500 and no machine. And 4 years later, he's got no money and no machine. So, Mr. Prospect, you see, you're not deciding, do I invest the money for the machine or don't I invest the money? What you are deciding is, 4 years from now, do I want $10,000 and the machine, or do I want to have no money and no machine? What is your decision, Mr. Prospect? On many occasions, salespeople come to me and say, you know, I can do everything but close. I mean, I know how to get prospects. I know how to set up appointments. I know how to handle objections. I can do everything but close. Well, what they're really saying is, I don't know how to sell. Because until you close, you're nothing but a conversationalist.
Step 5, follow up on all your customers.
Selling is such a fine profession. Just because, in your opinion, you've got that sales order safe in your hot little hands doesn't mean your work is over. In fact, a lot remains to be done. The sale you've just made should mark the beginning of a long and fruitful relationship with your customers, one in which the customer regards you as a reliable expert in your area and someone with whom he will gladly do business again. One of the highest compliments any salesperson can receive is to have a prospect referred to him by a happy customer. You can help make this happen by consistently and conscientiously following up on all of your customers. For openers, once the sale is completed, send a note or make a call, thanking your client for his business, making sure he's happy with the product, and asking him whether he needs anything else. A short while later, contact him again and let him know the outcome of your calls to the referrals he gave you. This is important for two basic reasons. One, he learns that you thought enough of his referrals to follow through on them, which also builds credibility for you, the salesperson. And two, it gives you one more reason to maintain contact with him. Once a sale is made, don't be afraid to plow the same ground again with a new product. Just because a customer has recently made a purchase doesn't mean that he won't be interested in buying again. So don't be shy about going back with your new offer. The good news is that each and every salesperson has a veritable gold mine of potential new sales living around in his or her old files. I would suggest that you regularly make contact with your old customers to keep them happy, to sell them new additions to your product line, and to get new prospects. During our time together, we've looked at 5 ingredients needed to become a successful salesperson: prospecting, presentation, closing, and a follow-up, all grounded in the key to the sales process, a positive self-image. To build a sales career, you need to acquire the knowledge of the successful salespeople and sales managers. You need to weave in a poetic philosophy of life which says that you can have everything in life you want if you'll just help enough other people get what they want. To the knowledge and poetic philosophy, add the common sense of an old farmer and know that you must work hard at seeing new prospects and servicing old customers. You have a moral obligation to work so hard at building your sales career that, as my friend John Nevin from Australia says, if anyone ever sees you coming and says, "Here comes a salesman," you won't let him down. And if you do all these things, I'll close as I always do by saying, I'll see you. And yes, I do mean you at the top.